I never should have accepted that mission to hunt down what the military called an unknown animal threat in the Montana wilderness. But when I found a missing soldier's dog tag hanging like a trophy around the neck of something that stood 15 feet tall, walked on 2 legs and spoke my name in the darkness, I realized we weren't hunting an animal. We were being hunted by something that used to be human, something that remembered exactly how soldiers think and move, and something that had been collecting military ID tags for a very long time. What happened in those frozen mountains near the Canadian border will haunt me forever, because I learned that some creatures don't just kill their prey. They study them first. I should never have accepted that mission. But when the commander walked into the tent with that grim expression I'd learned to recognize over my 15 years of service, I knew something was different this time. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or the usual briefing protocol. Instead, he dropped a manila folder on the makeshift table and said the army had finally decided to act against what he called an unknown animal. Threat of significant concern. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire. Unknown animal threat. In all my years tracking insurgents through Afghan mountains and patrolling hostile territories where every shadow could hide an enemy, I'd never been briefed on wildlife. Animals were background noise, environmental factors to consider, but never the primary objective. Yet here I was, listening to my commanding officer explain that something in the remote forests of northern Montana had caught the attention of people far above my pay grade. "This isn't a standard reconnaissance mission, Sergeant," he continued, his weathered fingers tapping against the folder. "We have reports of unusual activity near the Canadian border, livestock deaths, missing persons, and—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Evidence that suggests we're dealing with something that requires immediate military intervention." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the Montana cold creeping through the tent walls. In 15 years, I'd seen commanders dance around classified information, speak in euphemisms about chemical weapons and human experimentation. But this felt different. This felt personal, like whatever was out there had gotten under his skin in a way that enemy combatants never could. My team consisted of 5 specialists. Harris, a tracker whose instincts had kept us alive in 3 different war zones. Thompson, our tech specialist who could read thermal signatures like sheet music. McBride, demolitions expert with reflexes faster than anyone had a right to possess. Peterson, medic and sharpshooter, and myself, leading a group of men into territory none of us understood. The briefing materials were sparse, almost deliberately vague. Satellite images showed vast stretches of wilderness punctuated by small clearings, but no signs of human habitation for miles. Weather reports indicated heavy snowfall and temperatures that would challenge even our cold weather gear. Most disturbing were the incident reports. 3 separate occasions over the past 4 months where search and rescue teams had found evidence of large predator activity, but no identifiable animal remains. "Your mission is to locate, assess, and if necessary, eliminate the threat," the commander said, sliding topographical maps across the table. "Radio contact will be maintained every 6 hours. Extraction point is marked here." His finger stabbed at a clearing roughly 15 miles from our insertion point. "Any questions?" I wanted to ask what kind of animal required a military response, why standard wildlife management couldn't handle the situation, and why the incident reports read like they'd been heavily redacted. Instead, I simply nodded and accepted the weight of another mission that felt heavier than it should. 3 days later, as our helicopter lifted off toward the coordinates that would change everything I thought I knew about what lurked in the darkness between trees, I felt that familiar pre-mission tension settling in my gut. Except this time it felt different. This time it felt like prey. The helicopter's rotors faded into the distance, leaving us standing in a silence so absolute it felt aggressive. I'd experienced quiet before, the breathless moments before dawn raids, the suspended stillness of sniper hides, but this was something else entirely. This silence had weight, pressing against our eardrums like we were descending into deep water. We stood in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, whose branches hung heavy with fresh snow. The air tasted metallic, sharp with cold that bit at the inside of your nostrils and made your teeth ache. It reminded me of my first patrol in Alberta years ago. That same frozen quality that made you feel like you were breathing in shards of glass. "Christ, it's quiet," Harris muttered, adjusting his pack straps and scanning the tree line with those hunter's eyes that had spotted IEDs from 100 yards out. His voice seemed to disappear into the air rather than echo, as if the forest was swallowing sound before it could travel. Thompson was already checking his equipment, thermal imaging scanner sweeping across our surroundings in slow, methodical arcs. "No heat signatures within immediate range," he reported, but something in his voice suggested the readings weren't giving him the comfort they usually did. "Terrain looks clear. For advance. Clear." The word felt wrong here. Nothing about this place felt clear. The snow beneath our boots was pristine, unmarked by any sign of animal activity. No bird calls, no rustle of small mammals, no distant crack of branches that usually punctuated forest silence. Even the wind seemed muted, moving through the pine needles with a whisper so soft it was almost inaudible. I pulled out the topographical map, checking our coordinates against the mission parameters. We were exactly where we were supposed to be, following a route that would take us through 12 miles of wilderness to reach the area where the incidents had occurred. On paper, it was straightforward. On the ground, every instinct I'd developed over years of combat was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. "Movement protocol," I announced, falling into the familiar rhythm of leadership that had kept my teams alive in hostile territory. "Harris takes point. I'll follow. Thompson monitors thermal. McBride and Peterson cover rear. Standard spacing. Maintain visual contact." As we began moving deeper into the forest, I noticed how our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, each crunch of snow beneath our boots carrying further than it should. The sound seemed to announce our presence to anything that might be listening, and I found myself unconsciously trying to step lighter, though I couldn't explain why stealth felt so suddenly crucial. The trees grew thicker as we advanced, their trunks massive and ancient, covered in bark so dark it was almost black. Between them, shadows pooled in ways that made depth perception difficult. What looked like clear paths would suddenly reveal fallen logs or hidden depressions that could easily break an ankle or worse. The canopy above filtered the daylight into a grey, diffused glow that made everything feel perpetually twilight. 20 minutes into our advance, Peterson stopped suddenly. "You guys hear that?" he asked, head tilted, listening to something the rest of us couldn't detect. We froze, weapons ready, straining our ears against the oppressive quiet. For long seconds, nothing. Then, just at the edge of perception, something that might have been the distant crack of a branch under weight. Too rhythmic to be natural settling, too heavy to be a small animal. Harris held up a closed fist, the universal signal for complete stop. His head was turned toward the sound, every muscle in his body tense, with the alertness of a predator, sensing another predator. When he looked back at us, his eyes held a question none of us wanted to answer. Something was moving out there in the silence, something large enough to break branches, something that seemed to be keeping pace with our advance. And somehow, despite all our training and experience, we all knew that whatever was moving through these trees wasn't supposed to be there. The smell hit us like a physical blow about 30 minutes deeper into the forest. Harris stopped so suddenly that I nearly collided with his pack, and I saw his shoulders tense in a way that meant danger. The same reaction I'd seen when he detected the scent of explosives or the metallic tang that clung to fresh blood. But this wasn't either of those familiar warnings. This was something that made my hindbrain scream alerts I didn't understand, a primal recognition that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the part of my nervous system responsible for keeping me alive. The odor was overwhelming. Thick musk mixed with old human sweat, the sharp ammonia sting of predator urine marking territory, and underneath it all the copper-sweet smell of fresh meat. "Jesus," Thompson whispered, pressing his sleeve against his nose. "What the hell is that?" The scent seemed to have claws of its own, digging into my nostrils and settling there like it intended to stay. It was the kind of smell that triggered immediate physical responses. My mouth started producing excess saliva, my stomach contracted with nausea, and every hair on my body stood up like I'd touched a live wire. Years of combat experience had taught me to trust these reactions. They were early warning systems that had kept soldiers alive since humans first learned to fight. Harris was studying the ground with the intensity he usually reserved for tracking human targets. "Marking behavior," he said quietly, pointing to a tree about 10 feet ahead. Dark stains ran down the bark in vertical lines, too deliberate to be natural, too fresh to be old weather damage. Something's claiming territory here. As we moved closer to examine the markings, the smell intensified until it felt like a living thing pressing against us. The stains on the tree weren't random. They formed a pattern too purposeful to be accidental. Parallel lines scored deep into the bark, spaced like fingers but too large for human hands, too precise for random claw marks. "Scent glands," Harris continued, his voice taking on the clinical tone he used when analyzing evidence that disturbed him. "But the placement is wrong, too high for any normal predator. Whatever did this had to rear up on its hind legs to reach that height." I found myself scanning the forest canopy, suddenly aware that we'd been thinking in 2 dimensions when we should have been considering 3. If something could mark territory 8 feet off the ground, it could also be moving above us, watching us from positions we hadn't thought to check. Thompson's thermal scanner was painting the area in electronic blues and greens, but the readings were inconsistent, flickering between signatures that suggested recent presence and empty forest. "I'm getting residual heat patterns," he reported, adjusting settings to try to clarify the data. "Like something large was here recently but moved on. The signatures are too scattered to be natural animal movement." McBride had found more markings on trees in a rough circle around our position, each one placed at the same impossible height, each one carrying that overwhelming scent. That made breathing feel like drowning. "It's not random," he called out. "This is perimeter marking, professional, like it knows we're coming." The word professional hung in the air with uncomfortable implications. Animals marked territory by instinct, following patterns millions of years old. They didn't think strategically about placement or consider the psychological impact of their markings. But these marks felt different. They felt like warnings, like messages specifically intended for human eyes. Peterson had wandered toward the edge of our defensive perimeter, following another set of markings that led deeper into the forest. When he called back to us, his voice carried an edge of controlled panic that made my blood run cold. "Sarge, you need to see this," he said. "There's a trail here, but it's not like any animal track I've ever seen." As we moved to join him, the scent grew stronger, more complex. Underneath the musk and territorial markings, I detected something else. The smell of intelligence, if such a thing was possible. Not the clean, predatory intelligence of a big cat or the pack cunning of wolves, but something that felt familiar and wrong at the same time. Something that smelled almost human but not quite. Something that understood exactly what it was doing when it marked these trees, when it left these trails, when it made sure we would smell its presence long before we saw what was making it. Something that wanted us to know we were being hunted. The trail Peterson had discovered led us deeper into territory that felt increasingly wrong with every step. Broken branches hung at shoulder height like natural barbed wire, but the breaks weren't random wind damage or normal forest wear. Each snap was clean, deliberate, made by something with the strength to tear, living wood apart without effort. "Look at the pattern," Harris said, crouching beside a fallen branch as thick as my forearm. The wood was still green inside, the break fresh enough that sap continued to weep from the wound. This wasn't torn off. It was twisted off. "See the spiral fracture pattern?" I knelt beside him, studying the evidence with growing unease. The branch had been grabbed and rotated with force that suggested hands rather than claws or teeth. But the spacing of the grip marks was wrong for human hands, too wide, too deep, leaving indentations that looked like fingerprints designed by nightmare. As we continued following the trail, the pattern of destruction became more disturbing. Branches were broken in sequence, creating a path marked not just by passage, but by deliberate demonstration of strength. Whatever had come this way wanted observers to understand exactly how powerful it was, how easily it could tear apart anything in its path. "Listen," Thompson said suddenly, holding up a hand for silence. We froze, weapons ready, straining to detect whatever had caught his attention. For several seconds, nothing but that oppressive forest quiet. then carried on air so still it barely qualified as breeze, came the sound that would haunt my sleep for years afterward. Footfalls, but not regular footfalls. The rhythm was wrong, alternating between the heavy thud of something large dropping onto four legs and the deliberate crack of bipedal steps. 4 beats, then 2. 4 beats, then 2. Like something that couldn't decide whether to walk upright or run on all fours, changing its gait based on some internal logic we couldn't understand. "Distance?" I whispered to Harris, whose tracking skills had kept us alive in more hostile environments than I cared to count. "Close," he replied, his voice tight with professional concern. "Maybe 50 yards, moving parallel to our position. And Sarge..." He paused, listening to another sequence of the impossible footfalls. "It's pacing us, matching our speed." The realization hit like ice water in my veins. Whatever was out there wasn't just moving through the forest randomly, it was tracking us, maintaining a consistent distance, studying our movement patterns. The broken branches weren't just territorial marking or displays of strength, they were psychological warfare, designed to unnerve prey before the actual hunt began. McBride had his weapon trained toward the sound, finger positioned just outside, the trigger guard in textbook-ready position. "Should we investigate?" he asked, though everything about his body language suggested he hoped the answer would be negative. Before I could respond, the footfalls stopped. Complete silence returned to the forest, but it felt different now, not empty but expectant, like the pause between lightning and thunder. We waited, hearts hammering, for the sound to resume from a new position, but it didn't come. Instead, we heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. From the direction where the footfalls had stopped came a sound that started as a low rumble, almost below the threshold of hearing. It rose slowly in pitch and volume until it became recognizable as vocalization, but not from any animal I'd ever encountered. It was trying to make words. The sounds had the rhythm of human speech, the attempted cadence of language, but the vocal apparatus producing them wasn't human. It was like listening to someone trying to talk through a mouthful of fangs, or hearing human intelligence trapped in an anatomy that couldn't quite accommodate human expression. "What the hell was that?" Peterson whispered, his medical training making him automatically catalogue the biological impossibilities of what we'd just heard. The broken branches around us suddenly took on new significance. They weren't just displays of strength, they were communication attempts. Something with near-human intelligence was using the forest itself as a medium to send us messages we were only beginning to understand. Messages that said it knew we were here, it was stronger than us, and it was deciding when and how to make contact. As we stood in that clearing, surrounded by evidence of impossible strength and intelligence, listening to echoes of almost words fading into silence, I realized our mission parameters had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning. We weren't hunting an animal. Something was hunting us. The snow in the next clearing told a story that defied every piece of wildlife training I'd ever received. Harris knelt beside the tracks with the expression of a man whose professional worldview was being systematically destroyed by physical evidence he couldn't deny or explain. The prints were massive, nearly the size of my entire combat boot, but elongated in ways that suggested anatomy no earthly creature should possess. They weren't bear tracks, though they shared the width. They weren't wolf prints, despite the suggestion of individual toe marks. They were something else entirely, something that belonged in paleontology textbooks rather than active military operations. "Jesus Christ," Harris breathed, using his knife to measure the length of one print. 14 inches long, 8 inches wide, but look at this. He pointed to details that made my stomach clench with primitive recognition of wrongness. "See how the toes are separated? That's not claw extension. Those are digits, fingers." I crouched beside him, studying prints that told an impossible story. The impressions showed clear evidence of finger-like appendages, but the spacing was wrong for any primate, and the size was wrong for any known animal. Worse, the depth of the prints suggested weight that should have required a creature the size of a grizzly bear, but the stride length indicated bipedal locomotion. "Here's where it gets really interesting," Harris continued, pointing to a section where the prints changed character mid-stride. "It was walking on 2 legs here. then dropped to all fours for about 10 yards, then back to bipedal, like it was experimenting with different gaits. Thompson had his thermal scanner trained on the ground, trying to detect residual heat from whatever had made the tracks. "These are fresh," he reported. "Made within the last few hours. The snow's been falling steadily, but these haven't filled in at all." As we followed the trail of prints, the story they told became more disturbing. Whatever had made them possessed intelligence enough to test different movement patterns, strength enough to leave impressions in frozen ground, and anatomy flexible enough to switch between bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion at will. But the most terrifying discovery was still ahead of us. McBride called out from the edge of the clearing, his voice carrying the controlled panic of a professional soldier encountering something that challenged his understanding of reality. "You guys need to see this," he said, pointing to a series of claw marks scored deep into the bark of a massive pine tree. "These aren't ground level." The marks were carved into the tree trunk, at a height that made my neck crane back to see them clearly. 10 feet off the ground, maybe 12, gouged deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath the bark. 4 parallel lines, each one as wide as my thumb, spaced like enormous fingers gripping the tree. "It stood up," Peterson said quietly, staring at the marks with medical fascination and growing horror. "Whatever made those prints stood up on its hind legs and reached that high. That puts it at—" He paused, calculating. 15 feet tall. Maybe more. The implications settled over us like a weight. We were tracking something that combined impossible size with human-like intelligence, something that could walk upright like a man, but possessed the strength to carve wood like soft clay. Something that left tracks suggesting it was comfortable moving on either 2 legs or 4, switching between gaits based on some internal logic we couldn't comprehend. Harris was studying the claw marks with professional attention to detail, but I could see the strain in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he traced the gouges with his finger. "The spacing is wrong for any known predator," he said. "These marks were made by hands, huge hands with claws instead of fingernails, but hands nonetheless." As we stood in that clearing, surrounded by evidence of something that shouldn't exist, the forest silence took on new meaning. It wasn't empty, it was expectant. Somewhere out there, something with the size of a giant, the intelligence of a human, and the claws of a predator was aware of our presence. Something that could reach 12 feet up a tree trunk without effort was also capable of moving above us through the canopy, watching us from angles we hadn't considered, planning approaches we couldn't anticipate. The prints led deeper into the forest toward terrain that would give us less visibility and more opportunities for ambush. As I studied the trail disappearing between the trees, I realized we were no longer conducting a reconnaissance mission. We were following a predator to its chosen hunting ground, and it wanted us to follow. Thompson's thermal scanner had been acting erratically for the past hour, flickering between readings that made no sense according to everything we knew about how body heat worked. He'd recalibrated the device twice, checked for equipment malfunction and run diagnostic protocols, but the inconsistent signatures persisted. "I'm getting human-level heat," he reported, adjusting settings to try to clarify the readings. "But it's not behaving like human body heat. The signature is too large, too dispersed, and it keeps disappearing completely before reappearing in locations that should be impossible to reach that quickly." We had taken position in a natural depression that provided cover on 3 sides, following standard protocol for hostile territory assessment. According to our mission parameters, we should have been tracking some kind of large predator, a bear perhaps, or a pack of wolves that had developed unusually aggressive behavior patterns. But the thermal readings suggested something that defied biological classification. The heat signature was appearing at ground level, then vanishing, then reappearing 15 feet up in the tree canopy, then dropping back to ground level, all within time frames that violated physics, unless we were dealing with something capable of moving through 3-dimensional space, with inhuman speed and agility. "There," Thompson whispered, pointing his scanner toward a cluster of pines about 60 yards from our position. "Definite heat source, human-sized, but—" He paused, frowning at readings that challenged his technical expertise. "It's crouched, or at least the signature suggests something human-sized but compressed. like it's folded itself into a space too small for normal human anatomy. Harris raised his rifle scope to examine the indicated area, scanning for visual confirmation of whatever the thermal equipment was detecting. For long seconds, nothing. Then his entire body went rigid with the alertness of a prey animal. That had suddenly realized it was being stalked. "Movement," he reported quietly, "but I can't get a clear visual. It's like it knows exactly where to position itself to stay hidden from our angle." The tactical implications were deeply disturbing. Whatever we were tracking possessed enough intelligence to understand line of sight, enough knowledge of human capabilities to stay just outside our visual range while remaining close enough to observe us, and enough control over its body heat to appear and disappear from thermal detection at will. Thompson was scanning methodically, trying to establish a pattern in the erratic heat signatures. "It's circling us," he said, voice tight with professional concern. "Slow, methodical, maintaining distance but constantly changing position. Classic predator behavior, but the execution is—" He struggled for words. "It's too sophisticated, like it understands our equipment capabilities." I found myself thinking about the claw marks we'd discovered, the impossible height of those gouges in the tree bark. Something capable of reaching 12 feet up a trunk could also move through the forest canopy with ease, traveling above our heads while we tracked ground-level spoor like amateur hunters. "New contact," Thompson announced suddenly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Heat signature just appeared behind us, approximately 40 yards. It wasn't there 10 seconds ago." We turned as a unit, weapons ready, scanning terrain that had been empty moments before. The forest looked exactly as it had when we'd established our position. No movement, no disturbance, no visual evidence that anything had changed. But Thompson's thermal scanner painted a different picture, showing the unmistakable outline of something large and warm, positioned precisely where it could observe our movements. "It knows we know," Peterson whispered, studying the readings over Thompson's shoulder. "Look at the posture. It's not hiding anymore, it's just watching." For several minutes we engaged in a standoff that felt more like performance art than tactical situation assessment. The heat signature remained motionless, apparently content to study us while we studied it, patient in ways that suggested intelligence and confidence rather than animal caution. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the signature vanished. Not fading, not moving away gradually, but disappearing instantly as if something had learned to control its body temperature at will, or had moved to a position that blocked thermal detection completely. The silence that followed felt different from the forest quiet we'd experienced earlier. This silence had weight, intention, intelligence. Somewhere out there something was deciding whether we represented threat, prey, or merely entertainment. As we maintained our defensive positions, scanning empty forest that we knew wasn't empty at all, I realized our mission had shifted without our knowledge or consent. We were no longer tracking a target. We were being evaluated by something that understood exactly what we were and was deciding what to do with us. The sound began as something felt rather than heard, a vibration so low it seemed to originate from the earth itself, traveling up through our boots and into our bones, before our ears could process it as actual noise. For several seconds, we stood frozen in combat-ready positions, trying to identify the source of a frequency that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the primitive parts of our brains responsible for recognizing mortal danger. Then the vibration rose in pitch, climbing through registers that human vocal cords couldn't produce, becoming recognizable as vocalization, but from an anatomy that shouldn't exist. What started as subsonic rumble transformed into something that was part roar, part howl, and part something else entirely. Something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. "What the fuck is that?" McBride whispered, his demolitions expertise providing no framework for understanding sounds that seemed to violate acoustic principles. The howl continued to rise, reaching pitches that should have been impossible for anything with the lung capacity to produce the initial low-frequency rumble. It was as if we were hearing two different creatures vocalizing simultaneously, one with the bass register of something massive, and another with the range of something smaller but still far larger than any wolf or coyote. Harris had his rifle, trained toward the sound, but his hands were shaking in ways I'd never seen during actual combat. "It's wrong," he said, voice tight with the strain of professional analysis colliding with biological impossibility. "No single animal can produce that range of frequencies. The vocal anatomy required, it doesn't exist." But the worst part wasn't the impossible range or the bone-deep vibration that made our equipment rattle in our hands. The worst part was what happened when the howl began to descend from its peak pitch, modulating through frequencies that started to sound almost familiar, almost recognizable, almost human. The vocalization was changing, incorporating elements that suggested language acquisition, like something was learning to speak by listening to human vocal patterns and attempting to reproduce them through anatomy never designed for human communication. Consonants that were almost recognizable, vowel sounds stretched and distorted by a mouthful of teeth that were the wrong shape and size. "Jesus Christ," Peterson breathed, his medical training allowing him to catalogue the biological impossibilities we were experiencing. "It's trying to talk. Whatever's making that sound is trying to form words." The attempt at communication was more terrifying than any simple animal vocalization could have been. Animals howl to claim territory, to call mates, to warn competitors. But this sound carried different intentions. Curiosity, intelligence, and something that felt uncomfortably like amusement, as if whatever was making it found our presence entertaining rather than threatening. Thompson's thermal scanner was painting confused readings, heat signatures appearing and disappearing in patterns that suggested the source of the vocalization was moving while maintaining the sound, circling our position while continuing the impossible howl-speech hybrid. "It's mobile," he reported, voice strained. "The source is moving, but the sound isn't changing in pitch or volume, like it knows how to project consistently while changing position." The howl reached its crescendo with a series of sounds that were unmistakably attempts at human words, distorted beyond recognition, but carrying the rhythm and cadence of language. Then it began to fade, descending through those bone-deep registers until it became vibration again, then silence. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant, waiting, like the pause between question and answer. Whatever had produced that impossible vocalization was listening for our response, gauging our reaction, learning from our behavior. Harris was scanning the tree line with methodical precision, but his breathing had changed to the shallow, rapid pattern of someone fighting panic. "It knows we're here," he said, "not just that we're in its territory, but specifically where we are and what we're doing." That howl was directed at us. As we maintained our defensive positions, weapons trained on forest that looked empty, but felt anything but vacant, I realized we had fundamentally misunderstood our situation from the beginning. The sounds, the tracks, the thermal signatures, they weren't evidence of some animal exhibiting unusual behavior. They were evidence of something that possessed animal capabilities but human-level intelligence, something that was studying us with the same methodical attention we were trying to study it. Something that was learning to communicate with us, whether we wanted it to or not. The clearing we discovered 30 minutes after the howling contained evidence that transformed our mission from wildlife assessment to criminal investigation. The snow was disturbed in patterns that spoke of violence, stained with blood so fresh it still steamed slightly in the frigid air, creating small patches of slush that looked like crimson flowers blooming across the white ground. Harris approached the scene with the methodical caution of someone who had processed too many crime scenes in hostile territory. But even his professional detachment couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders as he began cataloguing what we'd found. "Multiple blood sources," he reported, crouching beside the largest stain. "Different ages, different viscosities. This site has been used repeatedly." Scattered around the clearing were fragments of fabric, torn pieces of clothing that looked military in origin, but had been shredded with such violence that identification was nearly impossible. The tears weren't clean cuts from blades, or even the ragged damage typically caused by large predator claws. These looked like the fabric had been grabbed and twisted apart by something with enormous strength and little concern for preserving evidence. Thompson was documenting everything with his camera, creating a record that our superiors would need to see, but his hands were shaking as he captured images of destruction that defied standard wildlife attack patterns. This wasn't feeding behavior, he observed, studying the distribution of blood and fabric. This was systematic, deliberate. But it was Peterson who made the discovery that changed everything we thought we understood about our mission. While examining the base of a large pine tree where blood had pooled and frozen, he called out in a voice that carried the controlled panic of someone trying to maintain professional composure while confronting evidence that challenged his understanding of reality. "Sarge," he said, holding up something that caught the filtered sunlight streaming through the canopy. "You need to see this." The object in his hand was a military identification tag, a dog tag, but it had been deliberately modified in ways that made my blood run cold. The standard military chain had been replaced with what looked like sinew, organic material that suggested the tag had been worn as some kind of trophy or talisman. Harris took the tag and wiped away blood and forest debris until the stamped information became legible. When he read the name aloud, the temperature in the clearing seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Rodriguez, Miguel A. blood type O positive, service number. He paused, cross-referencing the information with data from his mission packet. "This is one of ours, missing in action from a training exercise 4 months ago. Officially listed as death by exposure, body never recovered." The implications settled over us like a physical weight. Rodriguez had been declared dead from hypothermia after becoming separated from his unit during winter survival training. Search and rescue operations had continued for weeks, but the official conclusion was that he had died of exposure in remote terrain and his body had been scavenged by local wildlife. Except Rodriguez's dog tag was here, in a clearing that showed evidence of repeated violent activity, modified to be worn as a trophy by something with the intelligence to understand what military identification represented and the manual dexterity to craft organic cord into a crude chain. "There's more," Peterson said quietly, pointing to additional metallic glints scattered around the clearing. 3 more tags, maybe 4, all modified the same way. As we collected the evidence, a pattern emerged that was more terrifying than any simple animal attack. Multiple soldiers reported missing over the course of several months, their identification tags collected and modified by something that understood their significance. This wasn't opportunistic scavenging or random predation. This was systematic hunting of military personnel, carried out by something intelligent enough to target soldiers specifically and confident enough to keep trophies of its kills. Thompson's thermal scanner began registering heat signatures again, multiple contacts positioned around the perimeter of the clearing, but these readings were different from what we'd detected earlier. They were larger, more numerous, and they weren't moving with the cautious behavior of animals avoiding human contact. They were moving with the coordinated precision of a pack that had decided it was time to stop hiding and start hunting. Harris was studying the modified dog tags with the expression of someone whose professional worldview was collapsing under the weight of evidence he couldn't deny. "These weren't taken post-mortem," he said quietly. "The modification work is too careful, too deliberate. Whatever did this had time and privacy to work on these tags without interference." As we stood in that clearing surrounded by evidence of systematic predation and intelligence-driven trophy collection, I realized our mission briefing had been either criminally inadequate or deliberately misleading. We weren't tracking an animal that had developed aggressive behavior patterns. We were tracking something that hunted soldiers for sport and kept souvenirs of its kills, something that had been operating in this territory for months while the military covered up evidence of its existence, something that now had us exactly where it wanted us. The attack came without warning, which should have been impossible given our defensive positioning and Thompson's thermal monitoring. But whatever hit us had either learned to mask its heat signature completely or possessed the kind of speed that made thermal detection irrelevant. One moment we were examining the modified dog tags, trying to process the implications of systematic predation targeting military personnel, and the next moment something massive dropped from the canopy with an impact that sent snow exploding in all directions and made the ground vibrate beneath our feet like a small earthquake. I threw myself sideways on pure instinct, feeling the displacement of air as something enormous passed through the space where I'd been standing, carrying with it that overwhelming musk smell we'd been tracking, and a wave of body heat that felt like standing too close to a furnace. The thing hit the ground where our team had been clustered and immediately spun with fluid grace that defied its massive size, positioning itself between us and our planned escape routes. "Contact!" Harris shouted, bringing his rifle to bear. But the target was moving too fast for accurate aim, flowing between positions with the impossible speed of something that weighed far more than physics should allow, while maintaining the agility of a much smaller predator. My first clear look at the thing that had been stalking us came as it paused for a split second in a crouch that was somehow both animal and human, and every piece of military training I'd received evaporated in the face of something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of how anatomy worked. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall even in its crouched position, with muscle mass that spoke of strength capable of snapping human bones like dried twigs. The body was covered in coarse hair so dark it absorbed light, making it difficult to focus on specific details. But the overall impression was of something that had started as human and been redesigned by a committee of predators. But it was the face that destroyed any remaining hope that we were dealing with some known species of large predator. The skull was elongated, stretched into a muzzle filled with teeth that were wrong in every possible way. Too large for the mouth, too sharp for any herbivore, too numerous for any natural carnivore. But the eyes, Jesus Christ, the eyes were human in their intelligence while being completely inhuman in their intent. McBride never had a chance. The thing was on him before any of us could react, moving with liquid speed that seemed to ignore inertia and momentum. One massive clawed hand swept down with the force of a sledgehammer, and I heard the distinctive crack of ribs breaking under impact that would have killed a bear. McBride's scream cut off abruptly as his chest caved in, but the thing didn't pause to feed or examine its kill. Instead, it spun toward Harris with the calculating precision of something that understood tactical priorities and knew exactly which target to eliminate next. Harris got off 2 shots. That would have dropped any normal predator, but the bullet seemed to have no more effect than mosquito bites. The thing flinched slightly at impact, but continued its advance without slowing, reaching Harris in 3 bounds that covered ground with impossible efficiency. "Run!" I screamed, though part of my mind was cataloguing details with the detached observation of someone whose training was still functioning despite complete psychological breakdown. The thing's hands had opposable thumbs. Its movement pattern suggested intelligence capable of tactical assessment, and around its neck, bouncing as it moved, were multiple dog tags strung on organic cord, trophies from previous kills. Thompson and Peterson were already moving, following pre-planned escape routes toward the extraction point, but our careful tactical positioning meant nothing against something that could drop from 20 feet up without injury and move across broken ground like it was level pavement. As I ran, I could hear it behind us, not the heavy crashing of some massive animal blundering through forest underbrush, but the controlled movement of something that knew exactly how to use terrain to its advantage. It was herding us, cutting off certain routes while leaving others open, driving us toward some predetermined location where it could finish what it had started. The last thing I saw before the forest swallowed us in our desperate flight was the thing standing over McBride's body, head tilted in a gesture that was disturbingly human, studying the results of its work with what looked uncomfortably like professional satisfaction. We were no longer conducting a mission or even fighting for survival. We were running from something that combined the worst aspects of human intelligence with predatory capabilities, that existed outside the normal biological order, something that collected identification tags as trophies and had been hunting soldiers, long enough to understand exactly how we thought and moved, something that was giving us a head start because it enjoyed the chase. The pursuit through the forest became a nightmare of calculated terror, with our hunter demonstrating tactical awareness that matched or exceeded our military training. Every time we thought we'd gained distance or found defensive positioning, it would appear ahead of us, behind us, or in locations that should have been impossible to reach without making noise. Thompson's thermal scanner had become useless, painting readings that defied physics as the thing moved through 3-dimensional space with the fluid grace of something that treated vertical surfaces as easily navigable as horizontal terrain. Trees became highways, rocky outcroppings became launching platforms, and the very forest seemed to reshape itself to accommodate predatory movement patterns that belonged in fever dreams rather than reality. "It's playing with us," Peterson gasped during one brief moment when we'd taken cover behind a fallen log, trying to catch our breath and assess our tactical situation. "It could have finished us back at the clearing, but it's drawing this out deliberately." He was right, and that realization was more terrifying than the physical threat itself. The thing pursuing us possessed enough intelligence to understand psychological warfare, to know that fear and exhaustion would make us easier prey than direct confrontation. It was conducting a campaign of terror that demonstrated not just predatory instinct, but strategic planning. Harris had taken point, using his tracking skills in reverse to try to anticipate our pursuers' movements, but every defensive position we chose was compromised within minutes. "It knows our doctrine," he reported quietly. "Every tactical principle they teach in survival school, every escape and evasion technique we've been trained to use, it understands all of it." The worst part wasn't the relentless pursuit, or even the growing certainty that we were being driven toward some predetermined killing ground. The worst part was the eyes. Every time I looked back, every time shadows shifted between trees, I could see them. Yellow eyes that reflected our flashlight beams with the brightness of natural mirrors, but held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably hostile. Those eyes watched us with the patience of something that knew the territory better than we did, that understood our physical limitations better than we did, that could afford to take its time, because escape was never really an option. They studied our movement patterns, learned our individual responses to stress, catalogued our weaknesses with the methodical attention of something that had been hunting humans long enough to understand exactly how we broke down under pressure. "Movement, 10 o'clock, Thompson whispered, pointing his thermal scanner toward shadows that looked empty, but registered heat signatures that came and went like flickering flames. "It's close, maybe 20 yards. But when we trained our weapons toward the indicated position, nothing was there. The thing had learned to use our own technology against us, appearing just long enough to register on thermal detection before vanishing, keeping us in a constant state of alert exhaustion that would eventually compromise our judgment and reaction time." Then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The sound of breathing that was too heavy to be human, too rhythmic to be animal panic, too close to be coming from 20 yards away. It was the breathing of something large and powerful that wasn't even winded by the chase, something that was maintaining position just outside our visual range while we ran ourselves into exhaustion. "It's right there," I whispered, pointing toward shadows that seemed too deep, too dark, even for dense forest. "I can hear it breathing." The breathing stopped immediately, as if our pursuer had been waiting for us to notice, had wanted us to understand exactly how close it could get without our knowledge. In the silence that followed, I could swear I heard something that sounded almost like laughter. Not human laughter, but the kind of sound that intelligence might make when observing something it found amusing. Peterson was studying our map with growing desperation, trying to identify alternative routes to the extraction point that might give us some tactical advantage. But every route led through terrain that offered perfect ambush opportunities, and we all knew our pursuer had been operating in this territory long enough to know every tree, every rock formation, every potential hiding place. "Extract point is 2 miles northeast," Peterson reported, but his voice carried the hollow tone of someone who knew that distance might as well be 200 miles given our current tactical situation. As we prepared to continue our flight, those yellow eyes appeared again in the darkness between trees, closer than they should have been, watching us, with the patient hunger of something that knew exactly how this chase would end. They reflected our light with inhuman brightness, while conveying very human intelligence, and in their depths, I saw something that chilled me more than the mountain air ever could. I saw recognition. This thing knew us individually, had been studying us long enough to understand our capabilities and limitations, and was conducting this pursuit with the methodical precision of something that had done this many times before. We weren't the first military team to be hunted through these forests, and unless something changed dramatically, we wouldn't be the last. Our desperate flight toward the extraction point became a lesson in how something with superior knowledge of terrain could manipulate human movement like pieces on a chessboard. Every time we tried to deviate from the most direct route, we found ourselves blocked by impossible obstacles, fallen trees that seemed to have dropped recently, rock slides that hadn't been there on our insertion route, ice patches that made safe footing treacherous. The thing hunting us was herding us along specific paths, driving us toward the extraction point, but ensuring we would arrive exhausted, demoralized, and separated from any tactical advantage our training might have provided. It was demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that belonged to military academies rather than forest predators. When we finally reached the clearing where our helicopter would arrive, my relief lasted exactly long enough to realize we'd been outmaneuvered completely. The clearing that had looked secure on aerial reconnaissance was surrounded by elevated positions that provided perfect fields of fire for something capable of moving through the canopy with ease. "It drove us here," Harris said, studying the tactical situation with the growing horror of someone who understood exactly how thoroughly we'd been manipulated. "This isn't where we chose to make our stand. This is where it wanted us to end up." Thompson's thermal scanner was painting heat signatures in a rough circle around our position, but the readings were inconsistent, flickering in patterns that suggested our pursuer could somehow control its thermal output, or was moving too rapidly for the equipment to track accurately. "Multiple contacts," he reported, "but they're not behaving like pack animals. It's like the same entity appearing in multiple locations simultaneously." As we established defensive positions in terrain that offered no real defensive advantage, the forest around just began to demonstrate why our pursuer had chosen this location for what felt increasingly like our execution. Trees groaned under weight that shouldn't have been supported by branches, shadows moved in directions that violated basic physics, and that overwhelming musk scent settled over the clearing like a living thing. Then, without warning, it appeared, not emerging from cover or dropping from the canopy, but simply manifesting at the edge of the clearing as if it had been there all along and we'd only just gained the ability to see it. In full view for the first time, the thing that had been hunting us through miles of forest proved to be even more impossible than our glimpses had suggested. It stood upright like a man, but towered over human height, with proportions that spoke of strength, capable of tearing vehicles apart with bare hands. The body was covered in coarse dark fur that seemed to absorb light, making details difficult to discern even at close range, but the overall impression was of something designed by Nightmare specifically to hunt humans. But it was what hung around its neck that stopped my heart completely. Multiple dog tags, more than we'd found in the blood-stained clearing, strung together on what looked like sinew torn from previous victims. The tags clinked together softly as the thing moved, creating a sound like wind chimes made from the identities of dead soldiers. Among them, clearly visible even at distance, was the tag we'd seen before, Rodriguez's identification, modified and worn as a trophy. But there were others, dozens of them, representing soldiers who had disappeared over months or years, all officially listed as training accidents, exposure deaths, or simple desertions. The thing studied us with eyes that held intelligence I recognized as human, but malice that was purely predatory, and when it opened its mouth to vocalize, the sound that emerged was the same impossible howl we'd heard earlier, but closer now, so much closer that it vibrated through our bones and made our weapons feel like toys in our hands. But this time, the vocalization included elements that were unmistakably attempts at human speech, distorted by anatomy never designed for language, stretched and twisted by vocal cords that belonged to something much larger than any human, but clearly recognizable as words. "Soldiers," it said, the word coming out in syllables that sounded like they were being torn from a throat full of razors. "Hunting or me?" The question hung in the air with implications that destroyed any remaining hope that this was some kind of animal that had developed aggressive behavior patterns. This thing understood language, understood military terminology, understood enough about human nature to appreciate irony. It knew exactly what we were and what we'd been sent to do, and it found our mission amusing rather than threatening. We'd been sent to hunt a predator, but the predator had been hunting us from the moment we'd entered its territory, studying us, learning from us, deciding when and how to collect us as trophies. As it began to advance across the clearing with movements that were fluid despite its massive size, I caught sight of the helicopter's lights in the distance, still minutes away from being able to extract us from a situation that had moved far beyond simple survival. The thing with Rodriguez's dog tag around its neck was no longer content to simply hunt. It was ready to feed, and we were trapped in terrain it had specifically chosen for that purpose. The helicopter's searchlight cut through the forest darkness like a sword blade, illuminating the clearing in harsh white light that should have provided salvation, but instead revealed the full horror of what we'd been facing. In that merciless illumination, the thing that had been hunting us was exposed in all its impossible detail, and I finally understood why the military had sent us to die, rather than admit what they'd been covering up. It stood 15 feet tall in the center of the clearing, muscles rippling beneath fur so dark it seemed to devour light, with proportions that suggested human intelligence, trapped in anatomy designed for killing. The face was elongated into a muzzle filled with teeth that looked like they'd been crafted by committee, some human flat for grinding, others predator sharp for tearing, all of them far too large for any mouth that had ever existed in nature. But the eyes, Christ, the eyes were what finally broke what remained of my sanity. They held human intelligence, human awareness, human memory of what it had once been before whatever had transformed it into this thing that wore dog tags like medals of honor. In those yellow reflecting pupils, I saw the terrible knowledge that this creature remembered being human, remembered enough to hate what it had become and to make humans pay for that transformation. The helicopter pilot must have seen it too, because his voice came over the radio with the barely controlled panic of someone whose training had never prepared him for biological impossibilities. "What the hell is that thing? Repeat, what the hell is that thing down there?" "Extract now!" I screamed into the radio, but the thing was already moving, flowing across the clearing with speed that defied its size, reaching us before the helicopter could descend to extraction height. It went for Peterson first, massive clawed hands moving with surgical precision to grab rather than simply kill, lifting him off the ground with ease that spoke of strength beyond anything natural. But instead of immediate violence, it held him up to the light, studying him with the patient attention of something cataloging another trophy for its collection. That's when I saw the intelligence that made this creature more terrifying than any simple monster could ever be. It wasn't killing Peterson immediately, because it wanted the helicopter crew to see, wanted witnesses to carry the story back to whatever military command had been, covering up its existence for months or years. The thing opened its mouth and spoke again, words that came out distorted by anatomy, never designed for human language, but clearly recognizable as communication directed at the helicopter hovering overhead. "Tell them," it said, voice carrying despite the rotor wash, despite the impossibility of what was happening. "Tell them, it hunts back." Then it turned toward the tree line, with Peterson still held in its grip, moving with purpose that suggested this encounter had always been planned, always been intended to send a message rather than simply eliminate witnesses. It wanted survivors, wanted someone to report back that their cover-up had failed, that whatever they'd been hiding in these mountains was tired of hiding. Harris and Thompson were already running for the helicopter as it descended, but I found myself frozen, watching as the thing that wore dead soldiers' identities like jewelry disappeared into forest shadows, taking Peterson with it, leaving me with knowledge that would destroy any chance of sleep for whatever remained of my life. The extraction was chaos, Harris and Thompson hauling me into the helicopter, while I screamed about dog tags and impossible creatures and military, cover-ups that extended back months or years. The pilot wanted answers I couldn't provide, explanations for biological impossibilities that challenged everything we understood about how the world worked. But as we lifted off, climbing toward altitude that should have meant safety, I looked down at the forest canopy and saw them, dozens of yellow eyes reflecting our lights, scattered through the trees in patterns that suggested this wasn't just one creature, but an entire population of things that had once been human, and remembered enough of that humanity to hate what they'd become. The official report listed Peterson as missing in action, killed by wildlife attack, body unrecoverable due to difficult terrain and extreme weather conditions. McBride was listed as killed in action by the same unspecified predator. The nature of our actual encounter was classified beyond any level I'd ever heard of, buried under so many layers of secrecy that I began to doubt my own memory of what had happened. But sometimes, in the middle of the night when I'm alone in my apartment, I wake to the smell of musk and old blood drifting through windows that are locked and sealed. I hear branches creaking under, weight too heavy for any normal animal, and when I look outside I see yellow eyes watching from shadows that shouldn't be able to conceal something that large. Because I know now what the military has been covering up, what they sent us to eliminate without warning us what we'd be facing. Somewhere in the forests of northern Montana, there are things that used to be soldiers, things that remember enough of their human lives to understand exactly what military identification tags represent and to wear them as trophies. Things that know how to hunt their former comrades, how to study human tactics and turn them against us, how to collect souvenirs from kills while leaving just enough survivors to carry messages back to command structures that would rather sacrifice entire teams than admit what they've allowed to exist in remote territories. Rodriguez's dog tag is out there somewhere, worn around the neck of something that might have known him before the transformation, something that chose to keep his identity as a reminder of what it had lost and what humanity had cost it. And if Peterson survived what was taken from that clearing, his identification will join the collection. Soon another trophy in a campaign of revenge that's been going on far longer than any official records will ever admit. They call it missing in action, death by exposure, training accidents. But I know what's really happening in those remote forests where search and rescue teams find evidence of large predator activity, but never identify the predator. I know there are werewolves in Montana, and they remember everything about being human except mercy. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this terrifying journey into the Montana wilderness. If this story sent chills down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales of supernatural horror. Smash that like button if you felt the terror of those yellow eyes watching from the darkness, and drop a comment below letting me know what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach around the globe. Have you ever heard local legends about werewolves or strange creatures in your area? Have you or someone you know ever encountered something in the wilderness that couldn't be explained? Share your own supernatural experiences in the comments. Your story might become the inspiration for our next terrifying tale. Don't forget to share this video with friends who love horror stories and supernatural mysteries. Together, we can spread these chilling tales to horror fans everywhere. Keep your eyes open in the dark woods and remember, sometimes the hunters become the hunted. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.